My name is Danny Kruger, and this is going to be the M272 intake manifold replacement on a Mercedes Benz. Mercedes sold the M272 V6 and M273 V8 in a ton of cars starting in the mid-2000s, and as those cars have started to age, they've provided a tremendous amount of value for the purchase price. Unfortunately, as they've kind of gained mileage, a very common cause of failure when buying secondhand is going to be the variable length intake manifold. We're going to be showing you today how to replace that on your standard M272 or your M273, and also if you have a V6 and you're trying to make it breathe a little bit better, we have something a little bit more exciting for you that we're going to be showing you how to install today. So today we're going to actually be removing the magnesium unit from the M272 behind me and replacing it with this composite retrofit from the M014 package SLK 350 Sport Pack. It's kind of a lot of info there, and we'll get into it a little bit later on, but ultimately what this is going to allow the vehicle to do is breathe a bit better and make a lot more power up top. This is a modification and an OEM Plus upgrade that is specific to the M272 V6. We're going to hop under the hood. I'll start kind of showing you guys some of the common points of failure, and then we'll start getting that old unit out of there and replacing it with one that is not going to cause a check engine light. But first, before we hop under the hood, let's take a look at some of the tools that we're going to need to get this job done. First off, I'm definitely going to recommend you grab a good pick set. A couple flatheads of varying lengths will do the same job for you and may be very helpful. A stick magnet is a great idea. Couple pairs of needle nose pliers, definitely a couple of different extensions of different lengths. You're going to want a 3/8 sized torque wrench. We also have a 3/8 ratchet with an angling head, a couple 1/4 inch ratchets of small and varying sizes. We're going to need a 17mm open-ended or box wrench, a T30. Also going to be doing a bunch of E10 sockets, something to cut some zip ties with. We will have some cable ties that are older, and I also have a little bit of Loctite just to get some of the fasteners seated once we are putting everything back in the car, and a couple of paint markers if you have those handy. Flashlight will definitely be your friend on this one. Bottle of brake clean and some rags, as we're going to be cleaning and prepping some surfaces, as well as plugging up the ports for the inlet manifold and where they go into the cylinder head. So you want to make sure nothing drops in there. And then in case of any debris, which there likely will be, you're going to want a solid vacuum cleaner to clean in between those surfaces. So as a step one, I'm definitely going to recommend you put the hood into service position. So just going to press on the red tab here and then push upwards until it locks. Give us a little bit more room to work since we are going to be at the rear of the engine. A good deal for this one. Step one now, we are going to remove the intake pipes and the front and rear engine cover so we can expose the intake manifold. So this one is actually already halfway off. Just going to twist these out. And this just lifts directly up, the front cover. And then again, we're going to twist this off, pull forward, remove the other pipe. We are going to remember to remove the secondary air pump hose. And then we can just lift the air filter housing directly off, exposing the engine. So now that we have everything exposed, our first job here is ultimately going to be to remove as much wiring as possible. The M272, the ECU, as you can see, is right on top. Same thing with the M273 you may be working on. The engine harness, as a result, runs all over the top of the engine, including on top of the intake manifold. So what our ultimate goal is going to be here, as you can see, this plastic protector on top of the wiring loom goes around the other side as well. We're going to be trying to ultimately flip that upwards so that we can then lift the intake manifold off. So step one, we're going to remove the hose for the secondary air pump. Just pinch and twist until it comes off. Don't really need to do it, but it's going to give us a lot more room to get to some of these connectors here. So I'm going to start off with the camshaft position sensors. So those are going to be the two round sensors on the front of the timing cover. You're just going to mine are pretty nasty in here, so I'm going to wipe them down a little bit. But you're just going to pinch and pull upwards. There we go, there's one. Okay, so those are the two camshaft position sensors. As you can see, these are a 3-pin versus the ones for the camshaft adjuster magnets are going to be a dual pin. So for those, they have a gray tab that you just slide upwards and then pull directly off. This is one that I would definitely recommend, both those and the camshaft position sensors, if you'd like to take a paint marker and draw a line. So I'll do that right here, just so we can tell them apart when we go to put the harness back onto the vehicle, because the length of the harness can make it a little bit trickier than you may be ready for. So draw dash on the top side for this one, And then on the front, for this guy right over here, ideally, it'll be a little bit less gunky than my vehicle that I'm working on today. But we'll do the same right over here with the flathead and pop off the camshaft adjuster magnet harness. So I'm just going to pull the gray tab upwards and off. And then the same with this one right over here. Just pull upwards so it clicks, and then it should slide right off. All right, so we are good here. That is the adjuster magnets as well as the camshaft position sensors. I'm going to slide this bracket right here. Just pry it off rather than undoing the zip tie. So that is out of the way. And then this last bit of harness is actually going to wrap around to our secondary air solenoid. I'm going to unplug that as well. The last bit of wiring on this harness that is going to be holding onto the passenger side cylinder bank here is down at the base of the alternator. Just watch yourself on the exhaust manifold if it is hot. So the plug we're talking about is actually right down here. If yours looks the way mine does, what you can do to save yourself a bit of time is there's another one of those metal brackets right up here. You can just pry it off of the bracket on the alternator, which should give you the room that we need to play with, while also not requiring you to disconnect that oily sensor. All right, so now as you can see, the wiring harness is much more limp, so we'll be able to kind of tuck this around and fold it upwards. Next thing we're going to do is unplug the ignition coils and then kind of work our way around the back of the engine. So you're going to do all three on both sides of the engine. Just going to pop the tab backwards, and then you should be able to squeeze down and pull off. This one may be a little bit trickier to get to. If you have a shorter screwdriver or a pick, it may be your friend. Squeeze and push off. And then we are going to remove the ground screws for the harness. Ultimately, everything that is a part of the wiring harness, we're going to need to disconnect here in order to, again, flip this upwards. So the ground back here on the passenger side is going to have to get removed. And we are also going to disconnect the plug at the back of the secondary air injection pump. I'm not going to need a screwdriver for that one. You just pinch on both sides and push it backwards. So over on the driver's side bank, it's going to be pretty much the exact same thing to start. We're going to do the position sensors and the adjuster magnet sensors right on the front, and then we're going to do the 3 coils over here, and then from there we'll do some additional connectors. So we do have this all loose at the front here. There is one additional, I believe it's a ground that runs underneath or to the power steering pump. I'm just going to cut this big zip tie. We will replace it later on. Give us a little bit more room to play with. This is holding the sacrificial pigtail for the camshaft adjuster magnet. Additionally, we are going to, this evap hose right here, we are going to move out of its bracket off of the PCV. And we are going to run a pick along the inside of this vacuum hose right here to get this disconnected, as we are going to have to free up all of this space here. Just working our way around the actual vent itself so that we can just pull this loose, breaking up the crustiness that has accrued over time. Okay, so that is loose. And we can move on to this connector right over here. There's going to be another tab right on the side, like facing me. I'm going to just push down on that and pull it loose. Now we are going to move on to just disconnecting the passenger side portion of the ECU. Mercedes does recommend that you keep the driver's side plug on this one connected throughout this service, and you just kind of flip the ECU upwards. A lot of folks will disconnect this entirely. If you are going to do that, I would definitely recommend you disconnect the battery, let the car sit for a while just for the sake of keeping everything kosher with the ECU. But these are super easy to undo, these plugs. You're just going to grab on either side, whichever one you're undoing, pull it outwards. It will release this quick connect here. There we go. So this one is now free. As you can see, it just kind of pulls directly out once you undo that connection. And then we can just lift the ECU off of the rubber bushings it sits on and kind of flip it out of the way. So that's going to give us access to these brackets. we are going to have to remove these and transfer them over to the new manifold, regardless of whether we're using the magnesium or the composite for the M014, but it's also going to give us some more room to get to the fuel injector plugs, as well as some of the other connectors we're going to need to get. So now that we have a bunch of the electrical connectors out of the way, I am going to undo this one right alongside the driver's side engine control unit bracket, which is again just a push down and pull, just to get a little bit more slack in the harness. All right, that one is secured with a zip tie that we'll have to cut, but we can now that we've kind of disconnected some of this harness, we can start undoing the E-Torx bolts that do secure that harder plastic that goes over the engine loom to the valve covers. So that's going to be an E10 again. There's one at the front on the driver's side, one I have directly between the second and third ignition coil on the driver's side, and then basically the same story over here. We have one right next to the oil fill cap, another one between coils 2 and 3 on this side of the cylinder head. And then, of course, let's not forget that ground by the ignition coil. We'll show you that one in a minute. And after that, we'll have all of the ones that hold this plastic bracket on. All right, so that is our E-Torxes out of the way. We do have a smaller one on this side for a ground as well. Going to grab a socket for that. We're also going to disconnect at the map sensor right up here. There is a plug. You just squeeze, pinch, and then push it backwards. All right. So now, as you can see, we have a little bit more slack on this side of the engine. We're getting there. And then we have T30 to undo the brackets by where the ECU would normally lie. So now that we have both of the brackets removed, we can actually lift this guy up and unclip it from our PCV hose. Be very gentle, because if yours has some mileage on it like this one does, that plastic clip is going to be rather brittle. All right. And then you'll see this is still secured to the engine. We don't have any slack here. That is because it does plug into the fuel injector. Those will be coming in a little bit. So we are also going to do this T30 bolt right here, as well as the two at the rear of the loom. Just crack them loose and then take them out. There is one last E-Torx that is holding on the passenger side bracket over here. It's going to be on the engine bracket, the one that you would use to pull the engine out of the car. It's this E10 right here. Additionally, pending what vehicle you're working on, M272, M273, there's going to be some variants. All right, now as you can see, we have a lot more slack in this. The next point of connection is going to be the 3 for the M272 fuel injector plugs, or 4 if you are working on an M278. Again, it's going to be very similar to the camshaft adjuster magnet sensors, where you will pull the gray tab upwards and then pull the injector plug off. They'll be a little bit trickier to get to. I recommend a flathead or a pick. Okay, so we have 1, 2, and 3 injectors sitting kind of at a diagonal angle. Those are going to be your fuel injectors on both banks. You will also find that at the very rear of the intake manifold, you will have a very similar looking sensor facing transverse. Those are going to be the sensors for your intake manifold runner flaps. Those are the ones that are actually picking up your variants that'll be causing you check engine light for intake manifold runner flaps, whatever it may be spitting back. So if you'd like to mark those ones, just so you don't get them mixed up with the fuel injector ones, they do look a little bit similar. I'm going to remove the injectors. Again, just pop the gray tab upwards, squeeze down with my hand and pull them off. Do that on these 3. I'll do it on the flap sensor and back, move to the other side and do the same thing. Then there's also this one that everyone forgets right up here. This is going to be another air reference. From there, the bracket that secures this denser part of the engine loom right here to the fuel rail, it is merely zip tied onto a metal bracket, so we can just stick a screwdriver and pry upwards to get that off. And as you can see, that has come loose. So the rearward flap sensor on the driver's side, you will have to unbolt the same engine hoist bracket to get to. To get the harness out of the way, though, we can pull the ECU to the side here just by untucking the loom from this bracket at the rear of the engine. All right, so we can kind of move that into a safe place where it is no longer in our way. To get to the flap sensor, we are going to have to remove some things. I am going to take my E10. I have the fuel line kind of moved out of the way here, and there is a bolt that's holding the bracket on over here. I'm going to disconnect that. I'm also probably going to remove the whole bracket just to give myself a little bit more room to play with. There's 2 E10s that secure it directly down into the cylinder head. So I'll get that out of the way. That should get me to the flap sensor. There's another bracket bolt right on top of the wiring harness right over here that I'm going to undo that goes into the intake manifold. I'm also going to slide this connector forward and off of this bracket right here. That'll give me a little bit more slack in the loom, and it should make for getting things off a little bit easier. So as you can see, we have some slack here. Ultimately, what's going to be holding this primarily at the front right now is going to be the line that goes underneath the map sensor and over underneath the secondary air pump. We are going to want to preserve this, of course, as we're going to need our map sensor later on. It's up to you, whatever is going to work easiest. You can either disconnect this line from the bottom of the map sensor, or you could actually just pop the map sensor upward and out of the bracket. We have freed up the bracket at the rear of the wiring loom, so now as you'll see, we can kind of shuffle it out from underneath the fuel rail a bit gently. And we now have a little bit more space to play with. We are now also at the point where we're going to want to disconnect the fuel line into the fuel rail, which I'll show you in just a second here, as well as unplug the mass airflow sensor and the throttle body. All right, so the connection for the fuel line into the rail is going to be a 17 millimeter. We are going to, of course, loosen this, crack it loose. You will have some fuel that comes out. I usually try to just tie it upwards as quickly as possible. You can also, if you have a plug that up. So that's cracked loose. And it can be a little bit fiddly, just be depending on the amount of workspace, but this is one of the tighter engine bays you'll have for this with the W203 chassis, so you should have a little bit easier of a time at home unless maybe you're working on a 209 with an M273. So I'm going to unthread this. Some fuel is going to leak out. We do have a rag down there. All right, not too bad. I am going to grab a cable tie this upright, maybe get a little bit more fuel out of the line because there is some pooled in there and I don't want it dripping too much. But from there, we can start moving on with unplugging again. As you can see, there's a lot of pliability in this harness now, which means I can get to that flap sensor down in the rear with a little bit of coaxing. So our sensor's right down here. I've lifted this up so I can get underneath. Might be tricky for you to see, but same thing as on the other side. We're just gonna move the clip upwards, get down, pinch, and pull it up. There we go. So that is loose. And now, the only things that are holding the driver's side harness on are going to be the mass airflow sensor, a couple of other sensors down here, and the throttle body. So we'll do those, and then we'll be almost ready to pull this guy. So next up, we have pretty much all of our harness loose here to the point where we can pretty much pull this directly out. But first, we have to move to the rear of the engine where the throttle body and the mass airflow sensor are. So we're going to start by unplugging the mass airflow sensor. It's another one of those clips with the gray tab like we've been working with on our injectors, etc. Pop it upwards, squeeze the tab downwards, and pull it out. All right. And then once we get that connector off, yours may look a little bit different, your mass airflow sensor, pending V8, V6, and age, but you're generally going to want to watch these tabs as they clip onto just right behind these bolts at the rear of the intake manifold. You're going to want to pull them away gently. They can be brittle and they often will crack. Then you can pull it upwards and out of the air intake boot. Okay, so now we have the mass airflow sensor out of the car. So, I mean, if we're imagining this sitting atop the air deflector boot, basically what you're trying to do is pull these guys apart on the brackets that they kind of slot into. From there, you can kind of wiggle it upwards. There's a little relief cut in it, and then just pop it straight out. If you do break these off, it's not really the end of the world. It's still going to seat and seal alongside the air deflector boot where it's supposed to. It just may have a little bit more wiggle in it. So ideally, if we can keep that a solid mount, then we're going to want to try and do that. In this instance, it came away with seemingly no damage, which is good. So now we can pop down to the air deflector and start removing that from the throttle body. All right, now we are back on the passenger side cylinder head. We are going to be disconnecting the vent line that goes from the oil drip tray, which is at the back of the engine, straight across to the air deflector boot. You can kind of see this big hose. All you're going to do is pinch and give it a little wiggle or twist, and it will pop right off. So now this air deflector will just unclip from our throttle body. I actually like to tilt it back first because there's a tab on the top and on the bottom. So once we get that tab off, usually we can wiggle the bottom one right off. And lo and behold, this is our air deflector boot. So this is actually going to end up being junk for us, as well as that throttle body, because we're doing the M014 retrofit, which uses a larger throttle body and a bigger deflector boot. Your mass airflow sensor you are going to preserve because that is the same between both engines. However, if you are just doing your standard M272 intake manifold replacement and not the M014, you are going to want to reuse this, the mass airflow sensor, and the throttle body. While we still have everything sealed up, the throttle body is still on the back of the motor and closed. It's a great time to blow all of the garbage out from around the intake manifold, because once we pull this up, the ports into the cylinder heads will be exposed. This one, as you can see, is particularly nasty, so I'm just going to blast out some of the junk and also probably hit it with a vacuum. If you have like a shop vac at home, that should do the job. Just clean all the way around. So we do have this kind of quick disconnect right over here. All you're going to do is pinch on the tabs, which you can barely see on this one. It's covered in goo. Squeeze them and then pull upwards. So that is loose. We have the low load PCV vacuum line that goes into the top of the throttle body. You're just going to, again, squeeze that and pull upwards. Sometimes this one will be stuck. It's got this little like straw type thing that goes into the throttle body itself. You can tuck that out of the way. And then we have one small connector at the back over here next to the driver's side of the throttle body. And lastly, for the plug for the throttle body itself, that plug is going to be at the bottom driver's side of the throttle body, and you are going to pull it directly towards the passenger side. There is a tab that you're going to want to squeeze. That plug at the bottom of the throttle body may fight you. There are a couple different courses of action. What we're going to do is actually just unbolt the throttle body from the manifold. There's only 4 E10 bolts that are going to secure it to the back. From there, after you crack those loose, you'll have the throttle body just pop off the manifold. It'll just kind of be flopping around in there, and then you can unplug it much easier. A lot of folks, when they're doing just the manifold swap and not the M272, will just unbolt the throttle body and leave it resting on the transmission while they drop the manifold down and in and then bolt it back up. You can do that. It's a little bit ill-advised, as you're allowing a little bit more of a chance of contaminants kind of settling down and into the intake manifold and the throttle body itself. So you're going to crack these 4 loose, pulling the last of the 4 throttle body bolts out. Just leave it up on the cowl. Now the throttle body will pop directly off of the back of the intake manifold, which will then, you can see right over here, it'll then allow us to access this plug right at the bottom a little bit better than when it was bolted to the manifold. And try and wiggle it around so that you can see, disconnect this. Got our throttle body plug right here, and I'm just going to squeeze these tabs inwards. You might want to use a flathead, but you're just going to coax this off. So now we have our M272 74mm throttle body out of the car. If you are using your magnesium intake manifold, you are going to be keeping this, as well as your mass airflow sensor, your air deflector boot. If you are upgrading to the M204 package unit, like we're going to be doing today, you're going to be using the M273 throttle body and the associated air deflector, so this is actually going to be trash. I do recommend, if you are reusing this, clean it up, get it all nice, and then put it back together. This one has some oil accumulation. The gasket is all nasty and stuck to the back of it. You will have that, so make sure you take the time to clean it up and prep it. So now that we have the throttle body off, everything is loose, we are basically ready to pull the intake manifold upwards and out. So we're going to choose to leave our fuel rail and our injectors here. For the time being, we'll transfer them over to the new one out of the car. There will be some vacuum lines up at the front. Once we tilt it forward, we'll be able to get to those and unplug them. But ultimately, what is holding this onto the vehicle at this point is going to be 8 E-Torx bolts that will loosen up and then pull this directly out. First, I'm going to check to make sure I have clearance around this wiring loom. If I don't, I may want to reassert any brackets or sensors that I can still disconnect, but this is looking like if I move things around a little bit, I should have a pretty good shot. So now it is time to loosen the 8 E10 bolts that go around the perimeter of the intake manifold and hold it onto the cylinder head. So if you actually look down with me right here, you will see there are some Torx bolts towards the inside, and then there are also E-Torx bolts on the outside. We're just doing those E-Torx bolts, the ones around the perimeter. There will be 8 on the M272. These inward ones are actually holding the plenum together, so you can undo those, but they aren't going to do you much good in terms of getting this thing out of the car. So I'm going to do those 8, crack them loose. So for the last one at the very back of the passenger side, we had left this engine pulling bracket at the rear on, so we had removed it on the driver's side. I am going to now remove that with the last 2 E10 bolts, just to give myself a little bit more room to get to the last bolt that's holding the intake manifold on. So I'll just crack these loose, pull the bracket off, and then I should have a good path right down to that last E-Torx to get the manifold out. All right, so we have all of our intake manifold bolts out. We're pretty much at the point where we can pull this thing upwards and out of the vehicle. I just want to double check, make sure I have everything in a manner where I can kind of just pull this manifold directly out. So getting the vacuum lines out of the way, making sure I have enough play to get the harness out of the way. On the driver's side here, we look perfectly good. Friendly reminder that the fuel rail itself is also coming out with the manifold on this one. You can choose to pull that out separately if you'd like. I'd prefer to just do it on the bench. So going to just kind of wiggle it around here, but looks like we do have plenty of space in this instance that with a little bit of wiggling back and forth, we can get this straight up and out and disconnect the vacuum lines for the secondary air pump at the front of the manifold. When we go to pull this out, I would caution you not to pull by the fuel rail. Our kit for the magnesium manifold does come with injector seals. However, of course, we'll have those included in the M014 package in case you do damage one. This being said, better not to pull by the fuel rail if we can help it. So I like to grab where the throttle body is, or used to be in this case. I'm going to try and tilt the nose upwards, but just a bit, so I can get at, there's a small vacuum line right in the front for the secondary air pump. I'm going to try and wiggle that one outwards. After that, we have the map sensor, which we'll switch over after we pull the manifold, and then the manifold is free. So if we're going at that line, a pair of needle nose of any length will definitely be your friend here. I'm going to try these stubby ones, and if these don't work, wiggle it off with the longer ones. Just give it a squeeze, a pinch, and pull backwards. So you will see that the plastic connector did break off in this vacuum line. That is unfortunately very, very common, especially when you're dealing with an original manifold. Fortunately, our new Pierberg unit does come with these new plastic fittings, and also the M014 package manifold just uses a straight press fit on. So that's fine, we'll just have to harvest the plastic connector directly out. No big deal, but we are now ready to pull this. Just pull it straight up and out. We want to try and keep from wiggling this if possible, especially when it's as dirty as this one is, because we don't want any dirt to fall into the intake ports if possible. So this one is not going to fight me too much. If you do have any connectors that are still attached, this is when they would make themselves known, but there we go. Okay, so now that we have the intake manifold out, this is a great time to take some rags like these ones, or shop rags, clean ones, and stick them in your intake ports. We are going to do a lot of cleaning and prepping of the surface here, but you always want to make sure that you're not dropping anything down in there.